Picture this. It is the winter of compliance year 4418, and you're standing on a frozen wooden porch in a place the galaxy has never heard of. The wind cuts across the fields at -40 degrees. The sky is the color of old iron. A man in a heavy canvas coat is standing in the snow with a leather satchel slung across his chest, his breath fogging in the air. Across from him, a towering figure in ceremonial concordance robes is screaming. The alien magistrate is holding out a document the size of a tabletop, demanding a signature that will sign away an entire human colony. The man in the canvas coat does not sign. He reaches into his satchel, pulls out a small envelope wrapped in twine, and hands it to the magistrate. It is a birthday card for an 8-year-old named Pell Hardigan who lives 3 houses down. The magistrate stares at the card. The wind howls. The man tips his cap, steps around the alien official, and continues walking his route. Galactic records would later call this the day humanity refused the universe. That is not what happened. The truth is far stranger and infinitely more dangerous. Humanity did not refuse anything. They simply kept delivering the mail. Before we descend into one of the most quietly devastating stories in Concordance history, if you enjoy uncovering the buried truths the official archives prefer to forget, please leave a tail flick of approval and subscribe. And tell me below, what world are you broadcasting from? I find it remarkable that across so many systems, we still gather around the same old stories. We are connected by curiosity, you and I, even when we are separated by the cold dark. The man in the canvas coat was Harlan Pace. He was 46 years old. He had no military training, no political ambition, and no surviving family. He was the only postman on a colony of 3,400 people. He walked 26 kilometers a day across frozen agricultural land carrying letters, packages, medicine, and gossip. He had done this for 14 years without missing a single day. He was not a leader. He had never wanted to be. That, as the Velthari archives would eventually conclude, was precisely the problem. To understand why a postman became the most dangerous human in the outer spiral, you must first understand the slow suffocation the Concordance had engineered across the sector. The Galactic Concordance was not, technically, an empire. It styled itself as a regulatory union, a benevolent coordinating body that brought civilizational standards to underdeveloped worlds. In practice, it was the most successful protection racket in recorded interstellar history. The Concordance did not invade worlds, it audited them. A new world would be contacted, forms would be issued, compliance officers would arrive with stacks of administrative requirements thicker than a man's forearm. Tariffs would be calculated retroactively. Fines would accumulate. Within a decade, the target world would owe so much in regulatory debt that its only path forward was to sign a standardization treaty, a document that transferred political authority to the Concordance in exchange for debt forgiveness. 47 worlds had signed such treaties in the prior century. 47 worlds had effectively ceased to exist as independent civilizations, all without a single shot fired. The outer spiral compliance sector was the Concordance's quietest success story. Most worlds in the sector had signed without resistance. They were small, agricultural, often religious, and almost always governed by a single elected official whom the Concordance could isolate and pressure. The strategy was elegant: find the leader, audit the leader, break the leader, inherit the world. Brennix Hollow was one of the last holdouts. It was a frozen agricultural colony on the third moon of a failed gas giant called Brennick. The colony had been founded 80 years earlier by climate refugees from a dying terraforming project. They grew cold-tolerant grains and raised a stubborn breed of long-haired cattle. They had no army, no orbital defenses, and no functional government in any sense the Concordance recognized. This last fact was the source of considerable bureaucratic irritation. Brennix Hollow had a town council that met irregularly. It had a doctor, a schoolteacher, 3 farmers who had been informally settling disputes for decades, and a postman. It did not have a mayor, a governor, a president, or any other title the Concordance's standardization schema could process. When Concordance survey ships first contacted the colony in 4407, the survey officer reported back in visible frustration that the subject population appears to function without a clearly identifiable executive node. That report sat in a Concordance archive for 11 years. In 4418, someone finally read it. The someone in question was Inspector Vale and Truss, and Brennix Hollow was about to become his problem. Harlan Pace, at this point, was simply walking his route. He had no idea that an alien magistrate 3 sectors away had just opened a file with his colony's name on it. Inspector Vale and Truss did not look dangerous. His species was the Hraxi, tall, thin-limbed, hairless beings with mottled gray skin and 4 small black eyes arranged in a horizontal line across the forehead. He stood nearly 2.5 meters tall and weighed almost nothing. He moved like a man wading through shallow water. His voice was soft, even melodic, and he never raised it. He was, by every available measure, the most successful compliance officer in the history of the Concordance Bureau. He had personally overseen the annexation of 9 worlds. He had never lost a case. He had never resorted to violence. He had once, according to a now classified internal memo, brought a planetary government to its knees using nothing but a misfiled import tariff and a polite letter. Truss's methodology was a thing of horrible beauty. He did not threaten worlds. He simply audited them with a patience that bordered on the religious. He would arrive on a target world with a small team of accountants and lawyers, request access to the planet's records, and then spend months, sometimes years, quietly identifying every administrative inconsistency, every unpaid tariff, every regulation that had been ignored or overlooked. By the time he was ready to present his findings, the target government would be staring at a bill so vast that surrender was the only mathematically rational option. The Velthari Compliance Archive, the most complete record of Concordance activity in the sector, preserves a chilling phrase Truss used in his private correspondence. He referred to his work as civilizational gardening. He saw himself as a patient man tending to overgrown plants. He pruned governments. He shaped them. He believed with absolute sincerity that he was helping the worlds he conquered. You must understand the mindset to grasp what came next. Truss was not cruel. He was not even ambitious in the conventional sense. He was a true believer. He genuinely thought that bringing Brennix Hollow under Concordance authority would improve the lives of its inhabitants. He had calculated, on his private tablet, that standardization would increase the colony's agricultural output by 19% within 5 years. He had even drafted a small, celebratory speech for the signing ceremony. In modern terms, imagine the most polished corporate acquisitions lawyer you can picture, multiply his certainty by 1,000, and give him the legal authority of a small nation. That was Vale and Truss. He was the kind of antagonist who would shake your hand, smile gently, and bankrupt your grandmother before lunch. When Truss opened the Brennix Hollow file in early 4418, he found the 11-year-old survey report and frowned. A world without an executive node was, to him, not a victory. It was an unfinished sentence, a garden that had been allowed to grow wild. He felt, by his own later admission, a deep professional offense. He flagged the colony for immediate compliance review. He boarded a Concordance transport, and he began drafting the ultimatum that would, 3 months later, sit on a wooden table in a freezing meeting hall and change the galaxy forever. The ultimatum arrived by orbital drop on the 14th day of the cold month. It was a single sheet of self-illuminating polymer, addressed to the executive authority of Brennix Hollow. When the colonists could not find anyone to give it to, they brought it to the town hall and put it on the table. The school teacher, a woman named Ada Rensk, read it aloud to a gathered crowd of perhaps 200. The document was brief and almost polite. The colony had 30 standard days to formally designate a single planetary representative, empowered to negotiate on behalf of all inhabitants. Failure to do so would result in the colony being administratively reclassified as ungoverned territory, a designation that, under concordance law, permitted immediate annexation without further consultation. In other words, choose a leader, or we will choose for you. The meeting that followed lasted 9 hours. It is preserved, in fragmentary form, in the personal journal of a farmer named Thomas Bray, which the Velthari archivists recovered decades later. Bray's account is invaluable because it captures something the official concordance record could never grasp: the texture of a community that did not know how to be governed. The colonists argued. They proposed candidates. Every proposed candidate refused. Ada Rensk refused because she was a teacher, not a politician. Marjorie Soto, the doctor, refused because she had patience to see. The 3 informal arbiter farmers refused on the grounds that they could not be trusted to speak for anyone but themselves. The town drunk volunteered and was politely declined. Several children proposed their parents, who in turn proposed their neighbors, who proposed the postman. Bray's journal records the moment with disarming simplicity. A girl of perhaps 9 years old, her name has been lost to history, stood up on a bench and said, "What about Mr. Pace? He knows everybody." The room went quiet. The proposal was, on its face, absurd. Harlan Pace had no political experience. He had no education beyond colony schooling. He had never held any official position. He was a postman. But the girl was right. Harlan Pace did know everybody. He knew every name, every house, every dog, every grudge, every birthday, every wedding anniversary, every newborn, every recent death. He had walked through every farm gate on the colony at least 3 times a week for 14 years. He had carried news from one end of Brennick's Hollow to the other, often before the news itself had finished happening. He was, in a sense the colonists had never articulated, the only person on the planet who knew the planet. The vote was held by show of hands. It was unanimous. Even the candidates who had refused voted for him. Harlan Pace was not at the meeting. He was on his route. When he returned that evening, cold and tired, the schoolteacher Ada Rensk met him on the road and told him what had happened. According to Bray's journal, Harlan listened without speaking, set down his satchel, looked at the snow for a long moment and said, very quietly, "No." He refused. He refused the next morning, when a delegation of 7 colonists came to his small cabin. He refused again at the town hall the following week, when a second vote was held in his presence and produced the same unanimous result. He refused a third time when Marjorie Soto, who had known him since he was a boy, sat across from him at his kitchen table and asked him to reconsider. He refused, the colonists kept voting for him, and the 30-day clock kept ticking. To understand why the colonists kept choosing a man who kept saying no, you have to understand what Harlan Pace's male route actually was. The concordance, when it later reviewed the case, made a critical analytical error. It assumed that Harlan Pace's role was symbolic. It assumed the colonists were stalling, choosing an obviously unsuitable figurehead to buy time. The concordance's own bureaucratic instincts blinded it to what the Velthari archivists, with their obsessive devotion to detail, would eventually piece together. Harlan Pace's male route was the colony's nervous system. Consider the logistical reality. Brennick's Hollow had 3,400 inhabitants spread across an area roughly the size of a small Earth continent. There were no functional roads in the modern sense, only packed earth tracks that froze solid for half the year. There was no public radio network, no functioning communications grid beyond a single emergency transmitter at the town hall. The colony's only consistent, reliable daily contact between households was a man walking with a satchel. Harlan did not just carry letters. He carried news. When the Voss farm had a calving emergency, he was the one who told Marjorie Soto to bring her veterinary kit. When the Hartigan children came down with winter fever, he was the one who told the neighboring families to keep their distance. When old man Petrov died alone in his cabin, Harlan was the one who found him, and the one who carried the news to the man's estranged son, 3 valleys away. He settled disputes simply by walking past them. He carried apologies between feuding farmers. He passed messages between young lovers whose families disapproved. He knew which households had run out of grain and which had a surplus, and he quietly arranged for the satchel to grow heavier on one leg of the root and lighter on another. He kept no records of any of this. He charged no fee. He did not consider himself to be doing anything unusual. The Velthari Compliance Archive, in its final report on the Brennick incident, calculated that Harlan Pace had, over 14 years, mediated approximately 11,000 individual interpersonal interactions on the colony. He had functioned as the de facto coordinator of every significant logistical, medical, and social event in Brennick's Hollow's recent history. He had done this without title, salary, or authority. He had done it because the mail needed to go out. In modern terms, imagine an entire functioning municipal government, health services, dispute resolution, news media, emergency response, social welfare, compressed into one quiet man with cold, cracked hands and a leather bag. He had been running the colony for 14 years, and the colony had not noticed because he had never told anyone he was doing it. The colonists, when they voted for him, were not choosing a symbol. They were finally, belatedly, formally recognizing what had always been true. This is the staggering, almost unbearable truth that the Concordants never understood. They thought they were demanding a leader. The colony was offering them the leader. The problem was that the leader did not believe in his own leadership, and that, paradoxically, was the source of all his power. Harlan refused the title because, to him, accepting it would have changed the nature of what he did. The moment he became the representative, he would no longer be the postman. The root would suffer. The nervous system would seize. He understood, in a way that no concordance analyst could ever grasp, that authority and function were not the same thing. So he kept refusing, and the colony kept voting for him, and the days ran down. Inspector Valen Truss arrived on Brennick's Hollow on the 28th day. He had grown impatient. He had decided to take the signature himself. He landed his diplomatic shuttle outside the town hall in the late afternoon. He emerged in his full ceremonial regalia, long gray robes, the silver collar of his office, a thin polymer tablet under one arm. He was accompanied by 2 compliance attaches and a recording drone. He had drafted 3 different versions of his celebratory speech, each calibrated to the emotional posture of the local representative. He was prepared for tears. He was prepared for anger. He was prepared for resigned dignity. He was not prepared for what was waiting for him. The town hall was full. Every household on the colony had sent a representative. There were 847 people inside, standing shoulder to shoulder in a building meant to hold 300. The air was hot with breath and wood smoke. On the long wooden table at the front of the hall sat a stack of papers nearly a meter tall. Truss approached the table and looked down at the topmost page. It was a handwritten declaration, signed and dated, stating that the undersigned was the planetary representative of Brennick's Hollow and was hereby empowered to negotiate on behalf of all inhabitants. The signature at the bottom was Tomas Bray, the farmer. Truss flipped to the next page. Same declaration, different signature, Marjorie Soto, the doctor. He flipped to the next, Ada Rensk, the schoolteacher. The next, Jonas Hardigan, a farmer. The next, a woman named Eleni Voss. The next, a man named Petros Dell. The next, Pell Hardigan, age 8. Truss kept flipping. The stack went on and on and on. 847 declarations. 847 planetary representatives. Every adult and most of the children on Brennick's Hollow had signed a document claiming to be the leader of the colony. Step inside the hall in that moment. Imagine standing in Truss's place. You have spent your career mastering a system that processes singular decision-makers. You have a tablet in your hand programmed to log the legal identity of one planetary representative. You are looking at 847 of them. Your enforcement protocol has no field for this. Your legal framework has no provision for this. Your tablet is, at this exact moment, refusing to accept the input. It is producing a small, polite error tone. You can hear it in the silence of the hall. Truss's tablet crashed. There is footage of this. The recording drone captured the moment in clean, high-resolution detail, and the footage was later leaked across the outer spiral by sympathetic Velthari archivists. You can see the precise instant when Valen Truss, the most successful compliance officer in Concordance history, realizes that he has been administratively neutralized by a stack of paper. He looked up at the crowd. He cleared his throat. He asked in his soft, melodic voice where Harlan Pace was. A woman near the back of the hall answered for everyone. "He's on his route," she said. The hall did not cheer. The colonists did not gloat. They simply stood there in their winter coats, watching the alien magistrate with patient, unreadable expressions. The recording drone captured their faces in long, unbroken takes. None of them are smiling. They look, the Velthari analysts later concluded, like people waiting for a bus. Truss left the hall without speaking. He boarded his shuttle. He returned to orbit. He filed a report with the Concordance Bureau requesting urgent guidance. The colony, his report stated with audible bewilderment, had complied with the ultimatum in a manner that could not be processed. The mail that day went out on time. The Concordance's response was swift and quiet. They did not declare war. They did not issue threats. They simply cut Brennec's Hollow off from the rest of the galaxy. The colony's orbital supply line, which delivered medicine, fuel cells, replacement parts, and off-world grain 4 times a year, was suspended pending administrative clarification. No formal embargo was announced. No notice was posted. The next scheduled supply drop simply did not come. The colony's emergency transmitter received no acknowledgement when it queried the Concordance routing station. The silence was the punishment. The first deaths came within 5 weeks. A child named Erie Brennan, 6 years old, died of a treatable respiratory infection because the colony had run out of the standard antiviral compound. 2 elderly farmers died of cardiac complications because their medication stocks were exhausted. A young woman named Hella Petrov died in childbirth from a hemorrhage that Marjorie Soto could have stopped with a single dose of a clotting agent the colony no longer possessed. Marjorie Soto kept a private journal during this period. The Velthari archivists obtained a copy decades later, and her account is one of the most quietly devastating documents in the entire Concordance archive. She writes in clear, unhurried handwriting about each death. She names them. She describes what she would have needed to save them. She does not editorialize. She simply records. Harlan Pace kept walking his route. This is the part of the story that the Concordance, when it later tried to understand its own defeat, could never quite process. Harlan did not call meetings. He did not give speeches. He did not organize resistance. He simply continued to deliver the mail, but his satchel grew heavier. He began carrying medicine from Marjorie Soto's depleted clinic. What little remained distributed according to a triage system the 2 of them worked out at her kitchen table. He carried hand-copied news bulletins, summaries of what was happening across the colony, written by Ada Rensk in a small, careful script. He carried letters of condolence from family to family as the deaths mounted. He carried, in his satchel, the entire emotional life of a community under siege. Marjorie Soto became, by quiet necessity, his second. She was 68 years old, gaunt, sharp-tongued, and exhausted. She walked beside him on his longest route days when her clinic was empty of supplies and there was nothing left to do but visit the dying. The 2 of them, the postman and the doctor, became the colony's only functioning institutions. The colony naturally tried to vote her in as planetary representative. She refused. The vote was held anyway. It was unanimous. She also refused to accept it, and Harlan, when asked, refused to recognize her refusal, which was the same thing he had been doing for himself. The Velthari archivists, reviewing this period, noted with something approaching admiration that the colony had now developed a fully recursive system of leadership refusal. Everyone was the leader. No one accepted the title. The colony functioned anyway. The Concordance, watching from orbit, escalated. A flagged transmission was sent down from Inspector Truss to the colony's emergency transmitter. It was a personal message, recorded in his soft, melodic voice. It expressed regret for the suffering of the colony. It explained that the embargo would be lifted the moment a single planetary representative was formally designated and empowered to sign the Standardization Treaty. It noted, with what Truss surely believed was compassion, that further deaths were preventable, and that the choice was entirely in the colony's hands. The transmission was played once in the town hall to a full crowd. When it ended, there was a long silence. Then Ada Rensk stood up and asked if anyone wanted to volunteer. Nobody did. The meeting adjourned. Harlan went back on his route. The Concordance, watching this, made the decision to escalate again. Inspector Truss requested military support. A Concordance enforcement cruiser was dispatched. It arrived in orbit above Brennick's Hollow on the 83rd day of the siege. It carried a full company of compliance enforcers and a particle beam capable of vitrifying half the colony in a single pass. Truss did not yet intend to use the beam. He intended to use the threat of it. He had, after all, never lost a case. He believed, with the unshakable confidence of a man who has audited civilizations into submission, that the threat would be enough. He was wrong, and his error was about to cost the colony its postman. Part 8. The cruiser hung in the sky above Brennick's Hollow like a black coin. The colonists could see it from anywhere on the planet. It did not move. It did not transmit. It simply hung there day after day, a visible reminder of the violence the Concordance could deploy at any moment. Truss broadcast a new ultimatum on the 85th day. The colony had 72 hours to surrender Harlan Pace as the de facto unlawful executive of an ungoverned territory. He was, according to Concordance law, personally responsible for the colony's noncompliance. His surrender would result in the immediate lifting of the embargo and the restoration of supply lines. His continued protection by the colony would result in escalating enforcement action. The colony refused. There was not even a meeting about it. The refusal was simply understood. The cruiser opened fire on the 74th hour. It targeted the colony's only landing pad and the emergency transmitter at the town hall, vaporizing both in a clean white flash that lit up the winter sky for 3 full seconds. There were no casualties. The Concordance had been careful about that for legal reasons, but the colony was now completely cut off from off-world communication. No further messages could be sent. No further messages could be received. The siege was now total. Harlan Pace kept walking his route. It was on the morning of the 76th hour that the betrayal happened. The Voss family, Eleni Voss and her 2 adult sons, Carol and Dern, had quietly contacted the Concordance cruiser using a private long-range communicator that nobody in the colony had known they possessed. The communicator was an heirloom from Eleni's father, who had been a minor off-world trader before the colony's founding. The Vosses had hidden it for decades. They had never told anyone they had it. The Voss family offered Inspector Truss a deal. They would identify Harlan Pace's route schedule and provide a location where he could be intercepted. In exchange, they wanted off-world evacuation for the 3 of them and a guarantee of safe resettlement on a Concordance core world. Truss accepted within the hour. The ambush occurred on the morning of the 78th hour, on a frozen track between the Bray farm and the Hardigan farm. 3 Concordance compliance enforcers in cold-weather armor stepped out from behind a windbreak as Harlan approached. Carol Voss was with them, in civilian clothes, pointing. Harlan did not run. He was 46 years old, his knees ached in cold weather, and he was carrying a satchel that contained, among other things, a birthday card for an 8-year-old named Pell Hardigan. There would have been no point in running. The enforcers beat him. The beating was by concordant standards. Restrained, they were under orders to take him alive. They broke 3 of his ribs and dislocated his left shoulder. They confiscated his satchel. They loaded him into a small lift vehicle and ascended to the cruiser in orbit. The entire operation took 11 minutes. The satchel, which had fallen open in the snow during the beating, scattered its contents across the frozen track. The birthday card for Pell Hartigan blew into a snowdrift and was lost. Several other letters were recovered, hours later, by Tomas Bray and a search party. They were delivered that evening by Marjorie Soto. She walked the rest of Harlan's route in his place. She did not say a word the entire day. The colony believed for several days that Harlan was dead. The Concordance broadcast no announcement. The cruiser remained in orbit. The Voss family did not return to their farm. They were already aboard the cruiser, awaiting their evacuation. The colony, in its grief, did something the Concordance had never anticipated. It kept functioning. Marjorie Soto walked the route the next day, and the day after. Ada Rensk walked it the day after that. The 3 arbiter farmers split it among themselves for a week. The colony's nervous system, which the Concordance had assumed was a single man, turned out to be a distributed function. The mail kept going out. The dying kept being visited. The condolences kept being delivered. The Concordance, watching from orbit, began to realize that it had captured the wrong thing. It had captured the postman. It had not captured the post. Part 9. Harlan Pace was not dead. He was in a holding cell on the Concordance cruiser, awaiting transport to a bureau facility for what the official paperwork called civilizational re-education. He was, by every conventional metric, a defeated man. His ribs ached. His shoulder was strapped into a polymer brace. He had not seen sunlight in 5 days. He was 62,000 kilometers from his colony, surrounded by enemies whose language he barely spoke, with no possessions except the clothes he had been beaten in. Most prisoners in his position would have broken within a week. The Concordance's re-education program had a 97% compliance rate. Most prisoners were intimidated by the sheer scale of the institution arrayed against them. They were political figures, military commanders, religious leaders, people whose identities were built on authority. The Concordance specialized in breaking authority. It had perfected the craft over centuries. Harlan Pace had no authority to break. He had refused it for 9 months. His identity was not built on power. It was built on a leather satchel and a 26-kilometer route. The Concordance, in capturing him, had captured a man whose self-conception was completely outside the framework they knew how to dismantle. He did not resist his guards. He did not argue with his interrogators. He answered every question they asked, honestly and at length. He explained in patient detail that he was not the leader of Brennick's Hollow. He explained that he had refused the title repeatedly. He explained that the colony had voted for him anyway, but that he had never accepted the vote. The interrogators, trained to detect deception, recorded that he was telling the truth. They were unable to process this. They escalated to senior interrogators. The senior interrogators reached the same conclusion and escalated further. Inspector Truss visited Harlan personally on the 11th day of his captivity. The recording of this conversation was preserved in the Velthari archive, and it remains one of the strangest documents in the entire Concordance record. Truss asked Harlan why the colony had chosen him. Harlan said he did not know. Truss asked Harlan why the colony continued to function in his absence. Harlan said he supposed someone had to deliver the mail. Truss asked Harlan if he understood that he was facing execution. Harlan said he had been told, yes. Truss asked Harlan if he had any last request. Harlan asked if his satchel could be returned to Brennick's Hollow so that the rest of his route could be completed. Truss left the cell without responding. He returned to his quarters and, according to a junior officer's later testimony, sat in silence for nearly 4 hours. Something had begun to break in him, though he would not have used that word. What Truss did not know, what nobody on the cruiser knew, including Harlan himself, was that Harlan had begun, in his quiet way, to deliver mail again. He had no letters, he had no satchel. What he had was 14 years of memorized names, faces, grievances, births, deaths, and small kindnesses. When the ship's cook brought him his daily meal, Harlan asked the cook about his family. The cook, surprised, answered. Harlan remembered. The next day Harlan asked again by name. He asked about the cook's daughter, whom the cook had mentioned in passing. The cook began to talk. Within a week, the cook was bringing him extra portions and lingering in the cell to chat. Harlan did the same with the guards, with the medical officer who checked on his ribs, with the junior interrogators. He did not preach. He did not recruit. He simply asked people about themselves, remembered what they said, and asked again the next day. It was the same thing he had done on his route for 14 years. It was the only thing he knew how to do. The Velthari archivists later identified this period as the moment when the Concordance lost the war it did not yet know it was fighting. A postman on a prison ship, with no formal power and no plan, had begun delivering the only thing he had left to deliver. He was delivering attention. He was delivering memory. He was delivering the simple, almost embarrassing experience of being known by name. It was the galaxy's slowest, quietest, and most boring revolution, and it was about to claim its first casualty. Part 10. Back on Brennix Hollow, the Voss family's betrayal had been discovered. The mechanism of discovery was almost comically mundane. Carol Voss, before his evacuation, had left his coat on a chair at the Hartigan farm during a final visit. In the pocket was a Concordance-issued coordination tablet with a partial conversation log still cached on its screen. Pell Hartigan, the 8-year-old whose birthday card had been lost in the snow, found the coat. Her father read the cached log. The colony knew within a day. The colony did not retaliate. There were no arrests, no trials, no expulsions. The colonists simply, without discussion, stopped acknowledging the Voss family's existence. The Voss farm received no mail. The Voss family was not visited by Marjorie Soto when one of them fell ill. Their letters were not carried. Their messages were not passed. When Eleni Voss, who had, in the chaos, not actually managed to leave on the cruiser, walked into town to buy supplies, the shopkeeper looked through her as if she were transparent and continued his conversation with the next customer. When she spoke, no one answered. When she sat down at the town hall meeting, the seats around her emptied without a word. It took 4 months. Eleni Voss came to Marjorie Soto's clinic on the 123rd day of the silence and asked, weeping, to be allowed to leave the colony. The colony arranged it. A passing off-world trader, contacted through a long-range emergency channel, agreed to take her and her remaining son. They left on a frozen morning in early spring. Nobody saw them off. Nobody said goodbye. The Velthari archivists, studying this incident later, called it the most precise act of social punishment in recorded outer spiral history. The colony had inflicted on the Voss family the only sanction it possessed, the withdrawal of community. It had not needed laws or weapons or institutions. It had simply stopped delivering the mail. While this was happening on the ground, Inspector Truss had returned to Brennix Hollow in person. He had grown desperate. The cruiser was still in orbit, but the threat of force was no longer producing compliance. He decided, against the advice of his attaches, to walk among the colonists himself. He believed, in his soft melodic certainty, that face-to-face contact would break the deadlock. It did not. Truss walked into the town hall on a market day and found it full of colonists conducting normal business. He stood in the doorway in his full ceremonial robes. Nobody looked at him. He cleared his throat. Nobody turned. He spoke in his measured voice, identifying himself and his authority. The conversations around him continued. A woman walked past him to reach a stall behind him. A child asked his mother for a piece of dried fruit and was given one. Tomas Bray, the farmer, walked within a meter of Truss and did not break stride. Truss raised his voice. Nobody flinched. He raised it again. The colonists. With the same calm indifference they had shown the Voss family, simply did not recognize his existence. There is footage of this, captured by Truss's own recording drone. The Velthari archivists released it decades later as part of their final report. You can watch the entire sequence, 14 minutes of footage in which an alien magistrate, surrounded by colonists, gradually realizes that he has no power because no one has agreed to grant him any. His voice rises. His composure cracks. At the 11-minute mark, he begins to shout. At the 12-minute mark, he begins to weep, soundlessly, 4 small black tears tracking down his gray face. At the 14-minute mark, he turns and walks out of the hall. He never returned to the surface of Brennix Hollow. He gave the order from orbit for Harlan Pace's execution within the hour. Part 11. The Concordance Tribunal that sentenced Harlan Pace lasted 9 minutes. He was charged with civilizational disruption, unlawful executive function, and incitement of distributed governance, the last charge being a new one, drafted specifically for his case. He was found guilty on all counts. The sentence was public execution by orbital incineration, the standard penalty for civilizational disruption, to be broadcast across 200 concordance-aligned systems as a warning. The execution was scheduled for the 41st day of his captivity. The Concordance, anticipating a major propaganda victory, invested heavily in the broadcast. The signal was carried on every major concordance frequency. Diplomatic delegations from 47 worlds were instructed to watch. The Bureau commissioned a ceremonial script for the executioner to read. Inspector Truss, in his final official act in the case, personally wrote the closing statement. Harlan Pace was brought to the execution platform on the cruiser's lower deck. He was wearing the same clothes he had been beaten in, washed and pressed by the ship's cook, who had taken it upon himself to prepare them. His shoulder brace had been removed. His ribs had mostly healed. He looked, in the high-resolution broadcast footage, like a tired middle-aged man at the end of a long workday. The executioner read the charges. Harlan listened. The executioner read the sentence. Harlan listened. The executioner asked, as concordance protocol required, if the condemned had any final statement to make to the watching galaxy. Harlan's final words, broadcast live across 200 systems, were not a speech. They were a question. He asked the executioner if his mail satchel, which had been confiscated during his capture and was, by then, in a concordance evidence locker, could be returned to Brennix Hollow. He explained that there were still letters in it that had not been delivered. He named the recipients. He named all of them from memory in the order of his route. The list took 6 minutes to recite. The broadcast carried every name. He finished his recitation. He thanked the executioner for his patience. He nodded to indicate he was ready. The orbital incineration was clean and instantaneous. The broadcast went dark for the customary 3-second silence. When it resumed, the concordance closing statement, Inspector Truss's carefully written words about the importance of compliance and the necessity of clear executive authority, played over a still image of the empty execution platform. The concordance had intended this as a warning. It became something else entirely. Within 72 hours of the broadcast, 4 concordance-aligned worlds reported administrative anomalies. Citizens were refusing to identify their executives. Town councils were dissolving themselves and reorganizing as distributed networks. Postal workers on 3 separate worlds walked off their official routes and began informal community circuits. Nobody had organized any of it. Nobody had needed to. Within 6 months, the anomalies had spread to 19 worlds. Within 18 months, 31 annexed worlds had formally adopted what came to be known across the outer spiral as the Brennix Protocol distributed refusal. No single executive community function organized around figures who refuse titles. The Concordance's enforcement mechanisms, designed for centralized governments, simply could not process the new pattern. Compliance officers were sent to the affected worlds and found that they had nobody to audit, nobody to threaten, nobody to break. They returned to the Bureau with empty hands. The Compliance Bureau, in modern terms, suffered an institutional cardiac arrest. Its caseload collapsed. Its enforcement officers had nothing to enforce. Its budget could no longer be justified. Within 10 years of Harlan Pace's execution, the Bureau was dissolved, its functions absorbed into a smaller and less ambitious diplomatic office. The Concordance itself, while it continued to exist, never again attempted a forced standardization in the outer spiral. Inspector Valen Truss did not survive professionally. He was reassigned, demoted twice, and eventually retired to a minor administrative post on a backwater world. He spent the last years of his life, according to a Velthari biographer who interviewed him shortly before his death, writing a long, unpublished manuscript about the nature of authority. The manuscript was titled, in the Hraxi tongue, The Garden That Would Not Be Tended. Its central argument, summarized in the biographer's notes, was that the Concordance had spent centuries perfecting the art of breaking leaders, and had failed to notice that some civilizations did not have leaders to break. He died alone, of natural causes, at the age of 140. Harlan Pace's mail satchel was eventually returned to Brennick's Hollow. It arrived 2 years after his death, shipped by an anonymous sender through 3 intermediary worlds. Marjorie Soto received it. She walked his route the following day with the satchel over her shoulder, delivering the letters he had named in his final broadcast. Several of the intended recipients had died in the intervening years. She delivered the letters to their families anyway. Nobody on the colony spoke of him as a hero. Nobody erected a statue. The colonists, when asked by Velthari interviewers decades later why they had not memorialized him, seemed puzzled by the question. He was the postman, one of them said. The mail went out. The Velthari archivists, in their final report, included a single closing observation. They noted that the galaxy had spent millennia assuming that every civilization had a head, and that the head could be persuaded, threatened, or removed. Humanity, on a frozen agricultural moon nobody had heard of, had quietly demonstrated that this assumption was wrong. Some civilizations were not built around a head. Some were built around a root. You could not threaten a root. You could not behead a root. You could only walk it, or refuse to walk it, and the walking was the civilization. Harlan Pace lost his life. The colony lost its postman. The galaxy lost its certainty. Thank you for joining me on this long, quiet descent into one of the strangest chapters in outer spiral history. If this story changed the way you think about authority, leadership, or the small daily acts that hold a community together, please leave a tail flick of approval and subscribe. Which forgotten civilization should we examine next? Tell me below, and I will see you again in the cold dark, where the old stories wait.